Hey, welcome to another episode of the We Not Me Inclusion in Action podcast. I am Nikki Harding, and I am here today with Lisa Parry, who is a principal in South Dakota. And Lisa has an incredibly inspiring story. Super excited to have her on here and tell her story and a little bit more about what led her here. So Lisa is principal of Pre-K-12 building. So, Lisa, could you tell us a little bit more about what you do? And I'll let you tell your story rather than me tell it for you.
Thank you, Nikki. It's nice to be here. Yeah, I'm a pre-K-12 principal in a rural South Dakota school, and I also teach AP Language and Composition to seniors. And I'll kind of even touch on that a little bit as we get into inclusion and strategies. I work a lot for the Department of Education in creating content for and facilitating teacher and principal mentorship. And love all things education, love to speak, love to create content. Came to this in a weird way, and I like to tell people this, and they're always surprised. I was raised in nursing homes, and I watched my dad take care of very, very vulnerable people, our grandparents. And I didn't know it then, but I was kind of learning at the knee of someone who was teaching me how to be an educator, because we deal with very, very vulnerable people's children. And, anybody who thought this wasn't going to be personal, anybody who says, oh, it feels so personal, well, because it is. And if you didn't think it was going to be, then you didn't really think through. So I'm happy to be here today to talk with you about inclusion and its importance.
Yeah. Yeah, we have people's babies that we're in charge of.
Absolutely.
So what this podcast is all about is shifting from thinking about individual action to collective action. So as a principal and speaker, how do you define true inclusion in schools beyond just thinking about policies and programs?
Well, as a writing teacher and an ELA teacher for 30 years, I traffic in stories. And I think that is probably the first layer of what inclusion looks like. It's knowing individuals and not looking at groups, whether it's a primary group or a subgroup. It's about understanding that, first of all, each group has a story. And then within that group, the subgroups have stories. And within those subgroups, every individual has a story. And anybody who tries to approach school leadership with through this broad lens or from an aerial view misses, all the beauty of what you see on the ground, or all of the challenges that you're going to see from the ground that aren't going to be apparent from afar. And so it starts with stories, I think, and knowing where people are, what they've experienced, what they want, what they believe they can have for themselves, what they think they deserve. And I also think it's about strengths. When I speak to administrators, I really admonish them to capitalize on their staff's strengths instead of trying to, mitigate all of the weaknesses. When you talk to people about what they're good at and you encourage more of that, it's interesting because some of the relative weaknesses or challenges they have kind of start to fade away when they double down on what they're good at. And I think that's very important for students and for teachers. Here's where I shine. Here's where I excel. I might never be good at that. So quit bringing it up. And this is born of my own frustration. I don't like data. I don't know how to make sense of it. I'm an English teacher. And so if I had to be great at data to lead my school, I wouldn't be here. What they recognize is I'm good with the people. I do the people work, and somebody else helps me with the paperwork. I don't want to be just scolded all the time for my, ineptness with data. I want to be celebrated for the personal strengths that I have. And that's really, really important when you're talking about inclusion.
Yeah, when you talk about collaborative teams as well. It's funny you mentioned data. That's one of my favorite things to do.
That's what makes the world go round, right? We're all different.
So I know that you have spoken on really big stages like TEDx stages. So what is one misconception about inclusion that you have to unteach audiences, or that is your goal to unteach audiences?
I think anytime you're talking about inclusion, bringing everyone in, giving everyone a seat at the table, there has to be a shift, a word shift. Again, here's the ELA nerd in me. It's not about them or what they do or they need. It's a we and it's an us. I think inclusive pronouns are so important. They're important in daily conversations. They're important in our writing. we need inclusive pronouns. And so when we're talking about inclusion, it's about someone else. It's about the whole. It's about Arlington School or South Dakota School and everybody who participates in that environment. And so I think working on that mindset shift from exclusive pronouns to inclusive pronouns is really important. And I think that that's one way people can start to train their brain to think differently. Because when we communicate differently, as teachers, I learn everything I teach, and I learn it. I mean, I know Macbeth now but like the back of my hand, which is not necessarily a good thing, but I've taught it so many times. When you think about something a lot, when you say something a lot, when you write something a lot, you start to absorb it. And so if people can even start with that small change of inclusive language, I think that that can make a big difference. And even if you're not quite there yet, if you're using us and we, the people who you're communicating with will perceive that you're there. And that's even maybe more important than the reality, because I might still be working on it. But if you think that that's my thinking, you're going to trust me, you're going to believe in me, you're going to be loyal to me, you're going to have a good experience with me.
Yeah. So when I talk to people about what I do, and when I tell them that really I'm focusing on teacher retention and school culture, and the name of my business is the Inclusive Leadership Lab, they're often confused, especially if they know my history and know that my background is in special education. And a lot of people think when we talk about inclusion, we're really focusing on special education, but that's not necessarily true. And I feel like you really understand that. So when you talk about that, how do you expand the definition of inclusion to include culture, language, neurodiversity, and even staff collaboration? How do you help people understand that?
Well, for every person in this world, there's a way of experiencing life. I don't know what the world's population is at this point in time, but for each one of us, there's a way of experiencing things. And I think inclusion in some ways is, we have defined it incorrectly. Like you said, our default is kids with special needs, kids on IEPs. And it isn't that. Like everybody is unique. Everyone is different. I taught in a school where I've been the English department. Like all my life, I was the English department. I was the only one. I was a unique. And so to have me included was important because I didn't have a team. And the team, well, I did have a team. The team was the team, right?
Right.
And so we often expect ourselves out of others. We think everybody's going to think like we think, talk like we talk, do like we do. And that is not the truth. And so when you really grasp and understand and accept, that's the word I'm looking for, that no one else thinks, acts, does, communicates like you do, and you want to be included, then that means that there has to be room for everyone else. And it's not about ELs, and it's not about neurodivergent, it's not about ADHD, and it's about everyone is unique. And if schools aren't celebrating that, then we're really in trouble, right? Because kids need and staff members need to stay if they believe that they're important to the conversation. And so I guess what I would say to everybody is inclusion is one person talking to another person. That is inclusion. And at its base level, you and I talking, because you and I are not the same. You just said it. You love data. I can't stand it. You're SPED. SPED scares me. You and I are not the same, but you're including me in your podcast, and I'm including you in my day. And we're not the same. And yet we're finding value in each other's experiences and perspectives. And that can happen all over my building, from a preschooler to a senior, from a veteran teacher to a new teacher. Every one of them needs to feel included, and every one of them has some things that are valuable, and they have some things that are actually maybe quite treacherous to the process. It doesn't matter. We're all there together, so we better figure it out.
Sometimes accepting that can be really hard for people, and transitioning from being a teacher to an administrator can be challenging. And I know that when I transitioned from a teacher to an administrator, there was more pushback from staff than I anticipated. And I know now that resistance is pretty inevitable. How did you manage some of that resistance and some of that pushback from some of the things that maybe you just talked about that seemed natural to you that you didn't expect from people?
I think the first thing you've got to point out to people is they're already doing it. And they're doing it for students or peers, and they don't even realize it because these people are more like them than maybe some of the students who, really unique challenges. And so you're already accommodating and differentiating, and you're already meeting people where they are. And so it isn't a new thing. It's just, you maybe have to take one additional step, or you maybe have to open one more door in your mind to see that this person doesn't really need an overhaul of the experience they're having with you, but they too could use a little bit of a tweak to the system. And, it's very human to be attracted to people who are like us, to be attracted to people who think like us, who enjoy the same things we enjoyed, not like reject the same things we reject. And so we're doing that for people all the time without knowing it. We're accommodating similar people all the time. And for whatever reason, we've been conditioned to think that it's such a big ask, to step outside a little bit to somebody who's quite different from us and to meet their needs. And so first thing is you're doing. Now you just need to expand the circle. You just need to put more chairs at the table because you've already got 10 chairs there. Now it's time for 5 more. And the other thing is, and this comes from James Clear's Atomic Habits, which everybody should read 10 times, or at least read the Cliff Notes online. You can find them. You have to ask people to engage in small changes. You have to ask them to do a choice board once a unit. You have to ask them to let kids, decide how they're going to demonstrate mastery, at least blank a blank. You can't say to people, all right, for all 25 kids in your class, each of them has to have an individualized rubric. And because here's the sad truth, the system is the problem. It's not teachers.
Yeah.
We work in a system that makes it unrealistic that we're going to meet every kid's individual needs in our classrooms of 25 or 30 kids. And I don't know many teachers who don't want to meet every kid's needs. I just know teachers who are unsure how to get that done. And so we have to ask realistic, small changes on their part and not get into the idea that it has to be this revolution in their classroom because everybody just balks at that.
Yeah, we really have to reiterate that we're all in this together and that it's always a team effort. Yeah. I just recorded another episode with somebody else that we have to keep saying that all students are gen ed students first and all teachers are teachers first.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I don't know where along the way we got so off that path. And I feel like actually, there is more inclusion than there was when I started in 1994. Classrooms are more inclusive. Students with challenges are more involved in terms of talking about special education. But there's still that us, them feeling that goes on. And some of the best teachers are teachers who have their own children who've had their own struggles, because nothing makes you better at something than empathy in the situation. And I think sometimes one of the biggest Achilles heels I have is I always like school, and school was easy for me and I enjoyed it and I wanted to be there. And so I come to it as an educator and I like it and I want to be there. And that can be a disconnect then between me and kids who don't have a similar experience, or parents who hated school, don't want to come to open house, don't want to come to conferences. And what do? We decide that's because they're not invested. We decide it's because they don't care. No, they got their butt kicked every day, 176 days a year for 13 years. They're not interested. They want to talk to the principal. They don't want to talk to the English teacher because it can be triggering, actually. But we come to these conclusions like they're not in it with us. No, they're scarred by it.
They had bad experiences.
Yeah.
And they're afraid the same cycle is going to be repeated with their kid, and they're being protective of their kid. Yep.
And they're either going to come in hot or they're not going to come in at all. And we have to understand and see that anger as hurt, and we have to see the avoidance as hurt. And I guess that's the conclusion I draw until I'm proven wrong, until that parent proves that, no, I'd be fine here. I just don't want to be. And that is the case for some people. But my default is always, you can't. And there's something around that. And I need to be curious about what that is.
I think that's the least dangerous assumption. Um,
Absolutely. It's the
and
one
I
I would
think
want someone to make of me.
absolutely.
There must be
Absolutely.
something there. There's a barrier and I can't see it. But I got to
So
see it and
how
then I can help remove it.
so how do you lead your staff in accepting that with you?
Well, because I actually get a lot of the heat. A lot of people don't want to have a conversation with the teacher. They want to come right to me. And I think that that's happening more and more than it ever has. And I had people come in and they're upset about what was done or not done, what happened on the playground, what happened in the classroom. And as I sit there and listen to people or read the email, I'm thinking like a detective. I'm not thinking like a victim. I'm thinking like a detective. I want to know what's going on. I want to gather as much information as I can so that I can respond to this appropriately because, responding to someone's fear with anger is not going to do anything to make them feel safe. It's only going to drive them further away. So I'm always starting with, what are you afraid of? And then how can I calm that for you? How can I reassure you? And so often when teachers ask me about, well, what happened when you met with, or what happened when you called? And I'll say that. I'll say, well, I suspected this. And as an admin, you have to do what you want others to do. You have to model that. If I sit in a room with a teacher and parents and myself, I'm not getting defensive. I'm not getting angry. I'm asking questions. And teachers see that. They watch it. They don't just hear me talk about it, but they see it in action. And I really think curiosity, you want to hear somebody's story, back to stories. I want to hear somebody's story before I make a judgment of what I'm going to do, what I'm going to say.
Yeah, I think you're right. Anger is usually fear in disguise.
And I love this, and I don't know where I got it, but like if somebody comes to you and they're at a 10 over an issue that's like a 1 or a 2, it's not
Hmm.
the issue. It's
Hmm.
something else.
Right.
If it's a tardy and they're just, well, it's not the tardy. So what is it? What is it?
Right.
Because nobody gets that upset over, one little infraction that gets you one little demerit or whatever it is. And so that's always my question and my thought to myself, what is really going on here? And I really like that. I really am interested in the mystery of what's behind it. And I like thinking about that and trying to come to conclusions and then acting appropriately.
So do you remember a turning point in your career where you learned that? Because um, I think as you're talking, I remember, I used to be a little bit teaching special education. We have kids who are often, emotionally dysregulated, and that can be a really high stress environment. So I used to feel a lot of stress, and then I learned that it's not about me. It's about teaching them, behavior is a skill, emotional regulation is a skill, just like math and reading is a skill. And as soon as I learned that, my life got easier and my life got less stressful, right? I'm just teaching them a skill. It's fine. Uh, and that was a complete shift for me. So I don't know, do you remember like a turning point in your career where you made that shift?
I remember when I was early in the principalship, and I'm a high school teacher, and I had a young student in my office, threw a snowball. I don't remember what. And I brought the high school teacher in and probably even brought a little bit of myself as a parent because I don't know if this comes through, but I'm pretty emotional. I have a lot of volume. I'm animated. So I've got this little person in my office and again, early, I haven't really shifted yet to being an elementary person. And I am just intense. And I can see on this kid's face, like this fear. And what I thought about was, and I'm a dog mom. I have 2 labs. How you sometimes see a person with a dog and pet the dog and the dog does this, and you know that that's a sign that something bad is happening. And I remember looking at this kid, and again, if it's a 1, and the 10 is a reaction, and thinking this kid is really, really scared of me right now. So one of 2 things is at play. Either child never gets in trouble at home, no one ever raises a voice, which is unlikely, or this child gets in trouble that kind of exceeds what I would think would be, necessary or appropriate in this situation. And just looking at this little face, I thought to myself, that was the moment where I knew I had to get curious. Because instantly I had this question, okay, why this reaction? And
Mhm.
so talking more, unfortunately, it was that little things escalated very quickly and very severely in this person's house. And so me coming in with any level of anger or intensity, just there was fear. And since then, I've wanted to know why people do what they do. Now, he shouldn't have thrown the snowball. I mean, right? I mean, but to be so fearful that something terrible is going to happen to you because you made a ridiculous choice and you're 5 or 6 years old, that was way too extreme.
Mhm.
And I think about that face. I really do. I think about that face and what that person was experiencing. And I notice I said person, because I think a lot of times people discount 5, 6, 7-year olds, kids, students, children. No, this is a person
Mhm.
sitting with me, and this person was unduly terrified, and
Mhm.
I needed to find out why. And
Yeah.
that was really the shift, especially as a principal. For me, it was easier when I was a teacher because I was with kids 50 minutes a day, 176 days a year, and I taught 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade English. So by the time they're juniors and seniors, I've already had them for 2 years, and we know each other. So if I get mad, they're good. They get mad, I'm good. We know each other. But when you're a principal and you kind of have this revolving door of people coming in, you don't know the person. You know the person. I know everyone's name, but you know every
Right.
kid. And it's important to get to know them. It's important to know the story.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. I remember sitting with kids who were completely dysregulated, throwing fits, and thinking, finally, at first, when you're a young teacher and you're just learning things, thinking, what is going on? What happened? Because like you, school was easy for me.
I
I
did.
love going to school. Yes, but none of this made sense. Why, this was such a trigger. But then, you learn about trauma. You learn everybody grew up like I did. This was a
Exactly.
completely different environment for them.
You're right.
So would you compassion and you learn to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and you learn, I'm the one with the fully developed prefrontal
Right.
cortex. I'm the adult here. I'm just going to sit here with you and wait you out. And then we'll talk about how we could have handled that situation better. And I'll just sit here under the table while you figure out how to get control of your emotions. Yeah,
I
that's
was
it.
actually,
Really make that shift.
I was sitting or I was Zooming yesterday with a former FBI negotiator. And she and I were just sharing that in our worlds, which are very different, but somewhat the same. You know, you are presented a person who's made a poor choice, and there
Mhm.
is going to be a consequence on the other end of that, right? Because sometimes policy is policy. So if
Yeah.
you make X mistake, Y happens. And she and I, though, were talking about the importance of the in between. That this person is treated humanely, and this person is respected, and this person is, heard. And it doesn't necessarily change the outcome because sometimes the outcome has to be the outcome, whether it's, a Saturday school in my world or an in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension, expulsion. And I may or may not agree with that, but it doesn't matter. Sometimes the end is just the end. And same for her. Sometimes an arrest led to an incarceration. And there was nothing she could do about that, no matter how she felt about this person involved. But what she could control and what I can control is the middle.
Mhm.
Once I have you, until once you leave me for whatever's next, I can I can treat you like a person. I can talk
Mhm.
to you like a person. I can listen to you. You can feel valued. And there's going to be a consequence that you're probably not going to enjoy.
Yep. Well, I think that's part of the teaching process, right? I was also a principal of an alternative school for a while.
Mm.
And, you never know what you're going to expect when you go to work as principal of an alternative school. And I remember completely straying from the script here, but I think this is a good conversation. So I had a kid that would destroy our property. And when I came into the position, that was something that was often allowed because this particular alternative school was only for students who had disabilities. And so the mindset of the previous administrator was that the IEP allowed that. And my mindset was, no,
Right.
that's not acceptable because these children are high school students and they're nearing adult life and they need to understand that they cannot go into the workplace and punch holes in the walls. Like they will get fired and arrested. Like this is so inappropriate. So we need to have explicit teaching of what is and is not acceptable. And real quickly, they understood what it was. We did social stories, we did pre-teaching, all those things. There were some really hard days, and there was law enforcement that was involved. We had a really good relationship with the local law enforcement. And there was one day that I did have to call law enforcement in, and the student was arrested. He came back the next day and he wrote me a note that said, I'm sorry I called you a bitch. And that meant a lot to me because he showed remorse, first of all, and it was remorse after law enforcement was called. Like he understood that there was a price to pay for the action. This was somebody who hadn't experienced consequences for a long time in his life, and it was a life skill. Yes, he had a disability that involved emotional regulation, but also he understood this is what real life is.
Right.
And I have to take ownership
Absolutely.
of going on in my life. So I thought that was a really powerful moment.
I think it's important to understand when, being lenient is helpful and when being punitive is helpful, because there are times for both. There's times for leniency, and that's the best thing for the kid in that moment. But there are times when the students do have to be held accountable for exactly the reason you just said. You're not doing them a favor, and it might feel like it in the moment. There are other ways, though, to get oneself calm, rather than punching holes or throwing textbooks around. There's other ways. And if you don't, if you don't push back against that, then you don't offer an alternative, right? Because that's fine. So you don't need something different to do. But as soon as you push back against it and you teach replacement behaviors, that's helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. If you could give every school leader a piece of advice, what would that be?
You have to solicit the input, the thoughts, the opinions, the complaints, the praise. You have to solicit that from everyone in your community. And by community, I mean school community and then the community at large. In order to include everyone, and again, because you can't expect yourself out of others, you may not even fathom that this might be something that a person or a subgroup or a group wants or doesn't want. You don't even fathom it. It doesn't even occur to you unless you ask. And so, I think this is especially important in, team building or rewards or motivation for teachers. What do they want? Like, I see on TikTok all the time, all these attempts by administrators to, show teachers they appreciate them. So they make it Orange Day and they bring in Fanta and Cheetos, and that's all great if that's what they want. But I often wonder, did anyone have a conversation with anybody? Because I think the currency in my school would be different. I think there's things they'd rather have than Cheetos and Fanta. No hate to people who do that. Maybe that's exactly what your staff wants. But I think we so often decide what to do, and we think it's such a good idea, but we don't test it anywhere. And people are too polite to say, no, thank you. We'd rather have, X, Y, or Z. And I think it's important as a leader to avoid, the one-offs and the little trivial things that you do. And you have to show up every day as someone who cares about each individual and who does their best to protect that environment so that individual can do his or her best and enjoy to the extent possible his or her experience. And that's a lot harder than bringing in Cheetos.
Yeah.
I'd love to bring in Cheetos, but I think that what people want is just they want daily reassurance and daily proof that you're there for them. That even if you don't see things the way they see them, you're going to listen to that. You're really going to take that into consideration, and you may or may not act on that depending on, the circumstances. But everybody needs to ask what people want. Christmas list. I have 3 adult children, but when it came to buying things for Christmas, you asked them what they wanted. even if you didn't ask them, they told you, right? There was a 17-page list of what they wanted. But, my son who loved a football and a basketball, I didn't get him G.I. Joe figurines. And that's a present. I could have wrapped that up just as well. But he wasn't into action figures or G.I. Joe, any of that stuff. Spider-Man, Batman. He wasn't into any of it. He was into sports. So what if I'm wrapping up Batman and Spider-Man and I'm feeling great about it? And he
Right.
might be polite enough to go, thanks.
Yeah.
But
That's making it about you, not about them. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So that's probably my biggest piece of advice is, make it about them. Find out what they want and then do it if you can.
Yeah. Yeah. So how can listeners connect with you or learn from you after this episode?
Awesome. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm there at Parry. And I've got a website, principalparry.com. And that's linked to my LinkedIn. And so you can learn a lot about me in both of those places. And my TEDx talk is linked to my website. So if you go to LinkedIn, you can get to my website. If you get to my website, you can get to my TEDx. And I talk about enjoying the uptime. I don't live for the weekends. And I don't live for summer. I know better than to waste 5 days a week wishing I was doing something else or somewhere else. At the point I get to that, I need to go away because life's too short. And I talk in my TEDx about my mom having her career was taken from her when she was diagnosed with cancer. It was taken. She did not give it up. And in fact, she would have worked until the day she died if she could have. And so when I'm kind of having a pity party and I'm sulking, I remind myself that I get to work. She did not get to work. I get to work. I don't have to work. I get to work. And I think that that's an important mindset too. So you can learn more about that in the TEDx.
Yeah. So I actually watched your TEDx talk, and my dad passed away 6 years ago next week. And he passed away a year after he retired. And I thought after that, why wait until you retire to travel and to enjoy life and to make choices in your life
Right.
that make you happy? And yeah, so I made a lot of life choices
Yeah.
after my death.
Yeah,
My
yeah,
dad-
it's true. And I guess I've always been somebody who tries to find good or make good out of terrible things. It's terrible when you lose a parent. You're always too young to lose your parents. And so she's gone, and I can't do anything about that. But to bring her back, but I can live differently, and I can, for my own children, like for all my years of work, like I made work everything. And now I've got 3 kids who I'm trying to get them to unlearn that because I don't want them to spend as many years in that as I did. That's the other thing too, when it comes to just helping people, telling them to go home, telling your teachers to go home. Stop going, hey, look at you, stay until 8 o'clock again tonight. I like it. Like, quit it. Quit
Yeah.
it. These are people. And if you're still doing that, you've done it for too long and you need to stop it. Because there's more to it. And you can ask Nikki and me because we've lost parents and we know there's more to it than the 9 to 5.
Yep, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you,
Absolutely.
Lisa. I really appreciate your time, and we should absolutely stay connected.
Yes, absolutely. I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much for the platform.